Sable, Episode 3, Boggs, Part 2 of 3. "You've seen this before?" Crow asked, leaning low to pass through the branches of the tree, trudging slowly behind Boggs, seeming unconcerned to stay beside the human. Boggs turned his head slightly, nodding. Once, and it wasn't exactly like what's been going on in Independence." Crow and Boggs had been traversing the dense forest for what seemed like hours, searching for this supposed witch and her demonic son. In those hours, they had come no closer to finding them, and it was starting to drive Boggs mad. He had used every trick in the book, every tool and trinket in his long brown duster, and nothing, absolutely nothing. Crow was no help either. Somehow, the supposed guardian of the forest knew nothing about these two beings, not a damn thing. Crow actually seemed surprised when Boggs began questioning it about the woman from the stories, like this was the first time he had ever heard of such a thing. The sun was starting to rise, bits of light peeking through the branches around them, and it was only reminding Boggs how little sleep he had gotten in the past couple of days. So, he decided to take a break from the search, finding a large stump and setting himself down upon it, rubbing his hands over his bloodshot eyes. "What happened?" Crow inquired further, finally standing up straight as he entered the clearing. Birds had taken to fly down upon its broad shoulders, chirping delightfully. "It was, about 100 years ago?" Boggs tilted his head towards the side, trying to get all the details assembled. And I was out in a small town in England, Yorkshire? No, that was the demon dogs." He sat and thought for a moment before snapping his fingers. Barnaby, a little hamlet in the rural part of the country. It was run by this family of aristocrats. Real important people, at least that's what they told themselves. They were probably 6 people strong. The husband, the wife, and their 4 kids, all teenagers at the time. The people of Barnaby swore up and down that these people were the cream of the crop, the nicest people you'd ever laid eyes on. Husband tended to the downtrodden in town, while the mother always helped around at the local school, and the kids, of course, they were bloody brilliant, and they always helped the elderly whenever they could. Between you and me, it's probably all horseshit. Something people say when talking about the dead and all that. In any case, one day, all 6 of them walk out into the town square, smiling as wide as they could with eyes glazed over and real milky. What did they do? They stood. Boggs gave a careless shrug. They stood there for an hour, just smiling, staring off into the distance. The villagers naturally went over to them and asked them if they were okay, and if there was anything they could do for the family, and neither of them responded. They just stood there. Then the sheriff decides that he needs to get them to the doctor. Clearly something's not right here. So he reaches for the father, speaking all calm-like, telling him everything's gonna be okay, and as soon as his hand grips the father's shoulder, he begins to move. People there said it happened so quick it was almost impossible to see. The father, once again, a bleeding heart to all he governed over, reaches for this poor man's hand and rips it off. Arms and all, which should be impossible. The other 5, they're not doing a damn thing. They're looking straight ahead as this poor bastard falls to the ground, and the father's not even done with him yet. No, that was just the beginning. He starts to mumble something under his breath, and he's just keeping that smile on his face as he walks around the sheriff like a vulture watching its goddamn prey. Boggs pulled out a cigar, lighting it despite Crow's obvious look of protest. Then, with the same unhuman strength, he rips the sheriff's goddamn head off. At this point, mind you, every one of those villagers are locking themselves indoors, praying and screaming, and not even the sheriff's men wanted to deal with this monster in human form. Meanwhile, the father? He just goes back to standing next to his family, smiling with blood all over him. "And you found them like that?" Crow reached for Boggs' cigar, crumbling it in his hands until it was nothing but dust. Boggs was about to pull another cigar from his pocket, but he had decided that it would be better for his immediate health if he didn't. "No," he started, standing up to stretch. "When I got there, they had already killed themselves, and a lot like in this case, I was left with no leads. Somehow a family of saints became a group of maniacs overnight. Could it have been hypnotism?" Boggs paused. The potential of that is what has me worried. He didn't bother to give Crow the time to ask the obvious questions. Hypnotism, as a practice in magic, is basically impossible. It takes years and years of vigorous training to just convince a willing participant to fall asleep, and them being willing is the key. He felt a charm in his pocket beginning to shake and rattle inside his duster pocket. Something magical was around. Something evil. He motioned towards Crow to begin walking again, the giant quickly obliging, gently lifting the chirping birds from its shoulders. There are so many checks inside the human mind that forcing someone to do something against their will isn't even worth the effort. Not that there haven't been those that have tried, but their subjects always end up the same way. Brain dead. The charm was practically humming in Boggs' ear at this point, causing him to wince. So the fact that someone could be forcing people to act against their will scares the shit out of me, Boggs responded plainly. If someone were to have that power, they'd practically be unstoppable. Crow was silent for a moment, lost in thought. That sounds rather bleak. Well, let's just hope that this person is running low on energy. They have to be draining, right? He muttered the last part to himself, sweat trickling down his neck. His heart was thumping deep inside his chest as the fear settled in. Of course he had thought about the possibility, even convinced himself that it was an actuality, but somehow speaking it out loud had made the terror all too real for him. Would he be able to handle this? Was there a way for anyone to handle any of this? He had to swallow down that fear, though. There was a town that was just as terrified as him, maybe even more so, and they had lost so much already to this evil. Boggs had to stay strong, had to believe he could end this. The charm was burning in his pocket at this point, and Boggs began to hear a whimpering cry somewhere to their left, mere feet away. He looked towards Crow, making sure he wasn't the only one to hear it, the giant nodding slowly, trying to remain silent. The cry became louder, much more desperate. "Someone hurt?" Crow whispered, leaning in towards Boggs. The man shrugged, though he began to take a few steps towards the whales. Soon, a few steps became a sprint as the cries turned into frantic screaming. His mind was racing so much that Boggs just now realized that there were two distinct voices screaming in unison, a shrill voice and a deeper, heavier one. Come on, Boggs cursed under his breath. Somehow, though the voices seemed so close, he and Crow had been in a dead run for what seemed like minutes. Trees rushed by them in a green blur, and soon the smell of the sea filled Boggs' nose. He came to a full stop, dumbfounded by the new scent. They were already near the beach? How was that possible? From what he could remember, the ocean was not only supposed to be further away, but it was also in the opposite direction. And now the screams were somehow in the distance, behind them. What the hell was going on? Boat? Crow questioned, seemingly just as confused as Boggs. Boggs looked towards the giant with a raised eyebrow, Crow having to point at what it was referring to. Boggs followed the point and stumbled back in bewilderment, the thudding of his heart increasing. There was, indeed, a boat that had come ashore, stuck in the thick sand underneath it. It had seen better days, having broken in half, pieces of shattered wood cast all over the beach. Boggs wasted no time, dashing towards the monolithic vessel, hoping to come across survivors or, well, anything to prove that this was actually happening. The Tempest? He asked himself, staring at the name written in gold trim on the moldy wood. He had heard of this ship before, a mercenary vessel filled with some of the toughest, cruelest seafarers in the world. This ship had seen countless battles on the open seas, if the tales were to be true, and there were those that believed that it was blessed by the devil himself. Boggs couldn't count how many stories he had heard of this ship, how many lives this vessel had taken over the years. As he looked, the same thought passed through his mind over and over again, scratching at him as he stared at the destroyed ship before him. It was impossible for the Tempest to be here, on this beach. 50 years ago, the Tempest had been taken down by the British Navy somewhere off the coast of Cuba. It, along with everyone on board, had sunk to the bottom of the ocean. If he wasn't the only one seeing this, it meant that he wasn't going insane. At least that's what Boggs told himself as he turned his head to look towards Crow. Maybe it had an answer to all of this. Crow, what the hell is going... Crow was nowhere to be found. And even worse, neither was the beach, or the boat he had just been looking at. Boggs was back in the thick of the forest once again, large trees towering over him, suffocating him with how close they were to his form. He stumbled to the ground, cracking his head open against one of the hard roots of a nearby tree. The world grew dim and dizzy as his mind tried whatever it could to process what was going on. The boat was just here a moment ago, and so was the giant. He was standing on a beach. How had he gotten here? All thoughts dissipated when he heard the familiar screams, this time right beside him. There was a tree just a foot or two away that looked different than all the others. It was pale, almost milky white, and the texture of the bark reminded Boggs more of skin than actual wood. To the left and right of this massive tree were roots that looked like legs that ended in 5 smaller roots plunging into the ground. Boggs almost didn't want to look up, but his body forced him to otherwise, and all of the air escaped him as he gazed at the horror looking right back at him. This was no tree. It was a man, or something that resembled a man. His skin was covered in deep, dark cuts, fluids leaking from them in thick globs. Boggs had to crane his head as far back as it could to make out the face of this thing. It had black eyes, no irises as far as Boggs could make out. They were opened wide in fear, and its massive mouth was constantly blabbering about as it cried? Was it crying? It seemed to have stopped making any actual sounds as soon as Boggs looked upon it. Where was its arms? Did it even have arms? If this was a nightmare, Boggs wanted to wake up right about now. Ma, the giant boomed out, its voice rocking the very earth. It began to bend its head down towards Boggs, branches and bird nests from the surrounding trees crashing down to the ground. Its head was massive, almost as big as Boggs himself. Its eyes probably the size of his head. There was a silence as the two locked eyes, its mouth quivering as it tried to think of the words to say to the stranger before it. Ma. Its breath smelled like fresh grass, and the rush of the wind almost sent Boggs back to the ground. What is it? Boggs had to cry out over the whimpering. I can't help you if you won't, tell me what's going on. Why was he trying to reason with this thing? Could it even understand him? The giant closed its mouth, moving its eyes this way and that before leaning back to its previous sitting position. It seemed to be struggling with something, grunting and squirming as the sound of heavy rustling could be heard above Boggs. Within moments, it brought down what looked like its arms, long, sinewy things that ended in root-like fingers that twisted and curved around one another. There was something stuck to its fingers, though. It was hard to make out at first with the shadow this giant formed with its mass. Once his eyes adjusted, Boggs scrambled backwards, his ass hitting the ground once again. It was a woman, a short, fat little thing with her belly spilling out of a rippled black dress. One of its eyes was missing, a burned patch of skin where the socket should have been. Her face was stuck in a look of horror, and it wasn't hard to see why. This giant's fingers had pierced through her form, nails coming out of her mouth, her chest. There were even a couple that were locked inside her legs, barely keeping them attached to the rest of her form. This was the woman from the tale Mr. Hatchet told him at the bar last night, and this thing must have been her son. Killed Mama, the beast bellowed, the ground groaning from the strength of its voice. It began to cry deeply, shaking the already dangling corpse around on its fingers. I killed Mama. For the first time in quite a while, Boggs felt absolutely helpless and alone. The sound of his own heart galloping inside of his chest almost blocked out the giant's pleas of remorse. Thud. Thud. He didn't know what to do, didn't know where to go. What had happened to Crow? Had he even seen Crow? Was he really seeing this? Wake up. Wake up, he repeated in his head, eyes transfixed on the corpse just slightly above his head, its one good eye seeming to look back down at him. Before he could speak aloud, there was something that crashed into the back of his head with such speed and strength that it sent his face into the cool mud below, stars filling his eyes. No, sweet child of the forest, a familiar voice boomed out. You did not murder your mother. A shadow loomed over Boggs, bending down to grip the man by the hair and yank him up. This vile man did the deed. Crow? Boggs asked as the skull face stared right back at him, mouth in a grimace of anger and disgust. Come on, you know I didn't do any... Crow's free hand crashed into Boggs' face, breaking his nose and probably all of his teeth. The world went dark around him, and his heart stopped thumping. He didn't feel it as his face smashed against the ground once more. He didn't feel anything, actually. There was just silence. Peaceful silence. Sable was written and narrated by me, Lane Lloyd. If you'd like to follow me for more updates on Sable, or just to follow my antics, you can always find me on Twitter, at @the_Lane Lloyd. That's LANELLOYD. Our theme song, Unfamiliar Places, was performed by Alex Langford and Trevor Eilers, which I'm really hoping I pronounced your last name right this time, Trevor. God, I really hope I did. Would you like to help the show out? Would you like to hear more stories from your old pal Lane? Of course you would. So hey, why not leave a rating or a comment, or hey, just spread the word about the show. That would be great, because I love telling stories. I love writing stories. This has been a fun experience so far, just being able to write and do it for not only for fun, but to share it with other people. Storytelling is still kind of awkward for me, because a lot of the time I keep most of my writing to myself, and so this podcast has really given me an opportunity to try and strengthen myself into that, because I do want to share my stories with people. I guess I just needed that extra push, and I'm really glad that I'm doing this podcast, and I'm glad to see that it's getting some listeners. It's getting some people to listen, and I say hello. And before I ramble on for too long, this is Lane Lloyd. This has been Sable, and we'll see you next week for the finale of our Boggs storyline.